Colonel Alyssa Morgan, a black female officer, arrived at the airport to escort her fallen comrade's body back home. She never imagined that a series of racist acts, thinly veiled as procedures, would unfold so openly, right in the heart of America. But they made a mistake, not just with her, but with an entire community that was no longer asleep. Can the consequences of such contempt be erased with a simple apology? Where are you watching this story from? Comment below and help spread the journey toward justice. Under the dim yellow lights of Houston Intercontinental's main terminal, the usual bustle of a busy day masked something quieter, heavier in the air. Loudspeakers called out flight updates one after another, blending into the clatter of suitcase wheels scraping across marble floors. Families shuffled by, adults glued to phone screens, kids darting ahead without looking back. It was just another ordinary day for everyone but one person. Colonel Alyssa Morgan gripped the handle of her small suitcase tightly in her right hand, though it held no ordinary belongings. Inside, pressed securely against her military ID, was a transport order authorizing the escort of a soldier's remains. Her dark green combat uniform was immaculate, every button and crease perfectly in place, as if even the uniform understood that today allowed no room for error. She moved steadily through the security gate, the sound of her polished black boots tapping out a sharp rhythm on the tile, like quiet drum beats cutting through the ambient noise. Each step was solid, purposeful, carrying a weight far heavier than any deployment pack she'd worn over the years. But today, the burden wasn't a weapon or a directive from command. It was a promise made at a hospital bedside, when Private Elijah Ward's elderly mother clutched Alyssa's hand with tearful eyes and said, "If anything happens, please bring him back to me. Don't let him be alone." That moment clung to Alyssa's memory like ink that would never fade. Elijah, the young, wiry soldier with the fire of defiance always flickering in his eyes, had fallen on a mission he was barely beginning. 22 years old, not yet promoted, not yet able to buy his mother a proper birthday gift with his officer's pay. Alyssa squeezed the suitcase handle tighter, fingernails pressing into the smooth leather, grounding herself in the present. The passengers around her didn't notice her. To them, she was just another officer, maybe headed home, maybe on assignment. No one knew that beyond the terminal's glass wall on the tarmac, a military vehicle sat in silence, and inside it, a casket draped with the American flag waited, a heavy symbol, not just for the oak wood, but for the unfinished dreams, the unspoken laughs, the promises left hanging. Alyssa weaved through the crowd toward the check-in area. Along the hallway she caught a few glances, some indifferent, others hesitant, as if the sight of a black woman in full uniform still didn't quite fit. She wasn't surprised. 2 decades in the military had taught her that racism didn't always scream. Sometimes it whispered in a subtle frown, an averted gaze, or a silence heavier than words. A boy in a gray hoodie dashed by, nearly bumping into her. His mother yanked him back, threw Alyssa a sharp look as if she were the problem, then turned away without a word. Alyssa simply shrugged, used to these invisible collisions. As the Atlantic Sky check-in desk came into view, Alyssa instinctively adjusted her beret and drew in a long breath, steady in her posture and expression. She knew today's duty wasn't just about paperwork, it was a matter of honor. For Elijah, for his mother, for herself. She stepped up to the counter, stopping in front of the priority passenger sign, and spoke clearly, her voice firm but calm. "Good morning. I'm Colonel Alyssa Morgan. I'm here under orders to escort the remains of Private Elijah Ward. These are my documents." The woman behind the desk, a young blonde with a name tag that read Savannah Miller, looked up. Her eyes moved quickly over Alyssa's uniform, lingered on the row of medals pinned across her chest, and paused slightly longer at her face. There was a flicker of something, surprise, discomfort, barely noticeable, but obvious to someone trained like Alyssa. Savannah looked down and began typing briskly. A short silence passed. Alyssa waited patiently, used to bureaucracy, to slow processes and robotic steps. But something in the atmosphere had shifted. The way Savannah exchanged glances with her colleague, the whispered words beneath her breath, it set every instinct in Alyssa on alert. Years of experience navigating high-stakes checkpoints had sharpened her senses, and she recognized the first signs of trouble. When procedures suddenly slowed, when eye contact disappeared, when silence thickened like fog, something was off. Savannah typed a few more times, then looked up with a stiff smile. But before she could speak, the static crackle of a radio broke the air. A team of airport security officers in uniform was approaching the counter quickly, drawing curious stares from nearby passengers. Alyssa tightened her grip on the suitcase. She didn't yet know what was coming, but her gut told her the promise she made to Elijah's mother was about to walk into a battle she hadn't prepared for. And this battle wasn't overseas. It was happening right here, on home soil. From behind the counter, Savannah still hadn't said a word. Her fingers tapped nervously on the desk, an uneven rhythm that hinted at hesitation. Alyssa glanced at her watch. More than 5 minutes had passed since she handed over her documents. She took a breath, keeping her voice calm. "May I ask where the delay is coming from?" Savannah looked up without responding. Her eyes drifted over Alyssa as if the question had come from an impatient traveler rather than a high-ranking military officer carrying out a solemn duty. Then she looked back down, pretending to type, though the screen in front of her didn't change. Alyssa tilted her head slightly, her tone still composed. "I understand the airport is busy, but my mission doesn't allow for long delays. I'm escorting a fallen soldier." Savannah remained silent, but from the left, a dry, impatient voice broke in. "Excuse me, ma'am, but could you provide another form of ID? This military card looks unusual." Alyssa turned. A tall man in an airport security uniform holding a radio was eyeing her with suspicion. The name tag on his chest read, "Craig Henders." Alyssa extended her hand politely. "This is my original military authorization, stamped by the Department of Defense and verified by my command. I can also provide an electronic authentication code if needed." Henders didn't take the document. Instead, he squinted, shifting his gaze from the paperwork to Alyssa's face, then stepped back and crossed his arms. His voice lowered, half probing, half dismissive. "I'm not saying I doubt it, but I've never seen a black colonel before, especially not a woman." The sentence sliced down Alyssa's spine like a cold blade, but she didn't react immediately. Her eyes blinked slowly, settling on Henders's blank stare. She knew this kind of conversation well, where suspicion wasn't born of missing information, but of unwillingness to accept what was right in front of them. "Maybe you should get out more," she replied, her voice steady, each word hard as steel. "There's no shortage of black women qualified to wear this rank, but not everyone likes seeing them in positions of authority." Craig Henders smirked, but said nothing. His eyes shifted from doubtful to dominant. He nodded toward 2 other security staff nearby, and they began walking over, surrounding Alyssa as if she'd caused a scene. One of them, a young white man, leaned in to whisper something to Henders. Henders nodded slightly, then turned to Savannah, raising his voice just enough. "Ms. Miller, can you verify this file, or should we call the senior TSA?" Savannah bit her lower lip and bowed her head even further. She didn't answer directly. Instead, she leaned toward her female co-worker and whispered something. Passengers behind them began murmuring. A middle-aged woman pulled her suitcase closer to her husband and said quietly, "Here comes another incident." A well-dressed white man in a button-down shirt furrowed his brows at Alyssa, his gaze a mix of curiosity and suspicion. Alyssa felt her pulse stiffen, not from fear, but from the realization that she was standing in the middle of an unspoken trial. A trial not based on rank or credentials, but on bias so deeply ingrained that people didn't even recognize they were exercising it. "I've submitted all required documents," Alyssa said slowly, her voice low but firm. "If you need further verification, I'm more than willing to comply. But I request to be treated with respect due to my role and this mission." A beat of silence followed. Then Henders raised an eyebrow and asked, "Respect? You think you deserve special treatment?" Alyssa looked him squarely in the eye. "I believe I deserve to be processed according to protocol. No more, no less. And I believe the soldier lying outside deserves to go home without delays rooted in doubt based on skin color." The words landed like a soft slap, causing Henders to pause for just a second. But instead of answering, he turned away and muttered into his radio. Alyssa knew then, this wasn't over. She felt it with clarity. Here, in a place that was supposed to function on logic and procedure, an invisible force was at play, prejudice. She stood silently. The people around her continued to stare, no one speaking up. Crowds don't always side with justice, unless someone is willing to break the silence first. Alyssa remained exactly where she stood, her hand clenched tightly around the suitcase handle, as if it were the last anchor of order in the rising tide of chaos. The air around her was no longer filled with quiet suspicion. It had morphed into something more overt, more persistent, and unapologetically forceful. Just minutes after Henders had stepped away, 2 airport police officers arrived. Their dark uniforms bore the prominent TSA emblem over the left chest, and their eyes scanned the terminal as though searching for a national threat. And at the front, naturally, was Henders, now returned in a more official capacity, flanked by authority and the backing of a system that stood behind him. "Ms. Morgan," he said, voice flat and procedural, "we've received information about a passenger whose identification does not match our security records." Alyssa turned her head slightly, her chin tilting with calm defiance. "I've submitted my military ID, escort orders, and a verification code issued by the Department of Defense. Everything has been reviewed." Henders didn't respond. Instead, he gave a subtle nod. The 2 officers stepped forward. The one in front was a broad-shouldered white man in his early 40s, his eyes as cold as steel. Officer Daniel Reese. Reese offered no greeting, no introduction. He simply swept his gaze over Alyssa from head to toe, thick with suspicion. "Open your handbag," he ordered, his tone void of courtesy. Alyssa unzipped the bag. Inside were color-printed documents, 3 letters of confirmation from federal military units, a secondary ID card, photocopies of her deployment orders, and a worn leather notebook, an item she carried on every mission. Reese leaned in, pulling each item out, flipping through pages like he was hunting for a smoking gun. He opened the notebook, his brow furrowing at the dense handwritten notes inside. "What's this for?" he asked. Alyssa gave a faint half-smile. "Tactical notes and soldier psychology logs. Not exactly terrorist code, if that's what you're worried about." No one laughed. No one responded. Reese exhaled sharply and snapped the notebook shut like it had insulted him. The second officer asked her to remove her gloves. Alyssa lifted her hands, peeling each finger out slowly before handing them over. In a steady but firm voice, she stated, "I'm not carrying a weapon. Everything's already been scanned and cleared at initial screening." "I'd rather check again myself," Reese replied, proceeding to inspect her gloves and unbuckle her belt. A moment later, he pointed at her polished black shoes. "Ma'am, I'll need you to remove your shoes." Surrounded by dozens of travelers, Alyssa was forced to stand barefoot, her posture stripped down to near humiliation, under the phone cameras that had now begun recording from multiple directions. A white female employee in an airport uniform stood nearby, watching the entire scene unfold. Her face held no confusion, no outrage, only a numb familiarity, as though this was far from the first time she had seen it, and never once considered stepping in. Henders stepped forward, flipping Alyssa's military ID between his fingers. "I've worked here for over 20 years, he muttered. "Never seen a black woman colonel escorting a fallen soldier." Alyssa held his gaze. She had stood in firefights where gunfire came down like monsoon rain, commanded troops to charge into death traps, and delivered news of death to the families of the fallen with steady hands. Yet, today, in a country that prides itself on freedom, she was being treated like a threat that needed to be neutralized. "You're right," she said, her voice low but clear. "Very few people have seen a black woman colonel in this position, not because they don't exist, but because they're overlooked, questioned, pushed aside, and sometimes erased, just like I am right now." A brief pause settled over the space. Nearby passengers began to murmur, "Why are they doing that to someone in uniform?" Henders ignored the whispers. He motioned for Reese to stop the search. Alyssa was handed back her belt and shoes, but the sense of exposure, of dishonor, remained intact. As she slipped her shoes back on, each movement carried a quiet force because her dignity had just been laid under someone else's feet. One of the officers gave her a slight nod, not an apology but an unspoken acknowledgement that something had gone too far, but not Henders. He turned away, muttered something to his team, and walked back to the desk, leaving Alyssa standing still in a uniform that had just been treated like a criminal's disguise. The tension lingering around the check-in counter hadn't yet faded when Savannah Miller returned, walking slowly as if each step were weighed against an invisible minefield. Her face was stiff, yet she tried to stretch it into a smile, so forcing it only served to emphasize her reluctance. She stood behind the computer monitor, avoiding Alyssa's eyes, and spoke in a tone laced with rehearsed detachment. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but due to current security policies, we cannot allow you to board the flight." Alyssa was still fastening her shoes. Her fingers paused for a second at the zipper before continuing, unhurried. When she stood upright, her uniform, though thoroughly searched, remained crisp and commanding, not because of the fabric, but because of how she wore it, with dignity sewn into every fold. She looked directly at Savannah, her voice calm but carrying an undercurrent sharp enough to slice through pretense. "Which policy, Ms. Miller?" Savannah flinched slightly. Alyssa hadn't raised her voice, hadn't accused, just asked a question. But that question cut deep, peeling back the safe script Savannah had been clinging to. "I'm escorting the body of a fallen soldier. I've submitted orders, identity verification, and a DOD authenticated code. No luggage violation, no security breach. So I would like to hear what policy is preventing me from boarding this flight." A long silence followed. Savannah blinked rapidly, as if silently pleading for someone else to speak. But at the adjacent desk, her coworker, who had been clacking away at her keyboard without interfering, continued to stare into her screen, determined to stay invisible. Savannah licked her lips and answered quietly, "Well, this is a special case, so we've had to apply additional controls, and according to the system, this verification can't be accepted for this flight." "You're telling me the system is rejecting a military colonel on duty?" Alyssa's voice didn't rise, but each word landed like metal striking stone. The bystanders, many of whom had looked away before, now began to turn back toward her, not because of the volume but because of the precision of her tone. Calm, sharp, leaving no place to hide. "Then, let me clarify," Alyssa continued, her voice now firmer. You checked my documents. All valid. You searched my belongings, found nothing. You questioned my identity. I verified it. And to this moment, not a single person here has named one specific issue. Yet you still deny this mission, based on a policy no one will define. She took a single step closer to the counter. Not aggressive, but enough to make Savannah lean back half a step. Let me help you if the truth is too hard to say aloud. The policy you're enforcing isn't in any manual. It's in the eyes of those who can't accept seeing a black woman in uniform, standing tall and refusing to be silent. Savannah froze. The face she'd hidden behind a professional smile was now stripped bare. Henders stood nearby, arms crossed, saying nothing. Reese, the officer who'd searched Alyssa, stood further back, his eyes shifting as if trying to decide whether to step in or step away. Alyssa locked eyes with Savannah and asked once more, this time not as a procedural inquiry, but as a demand for justice. So can you tell me the exact reason I'm being denied? And who will take responsibility if a fallen soldier has to wait even one more hour to come home? Savannah said nothing. She simply blinked, then lowered her head as though something invisible had struck her. She turned back to the computer screen, tapped a few keys, and looked up at Alyssa one final time, not with that weak smile, but with raw, exposed uncertainty. I'm very sorry, but I don't have the authority to override a system decision. Alyssa closed her eyes for half a second, not out of weariness, but to seal off the last illusion that reason alone could dismantle a structure as deeply rooted as prejudice. She opened them again, nodding slightly. I understand, and I'm not asking you to exceed your authority. I just want everyone here to ask themselves why a soldier willing to endure hardship and serve this country isn't allowed to board a plane. At that moment, no one behind the counter could meet her eyes, and Alyssa, though rejected, though ignored, stood there with the unshaken bearing of a commander. Because respect may be withheld by the small-minded, but dignity cannot be taken from you unless you let them have it. Alyssa's final words still echoed through the main terminal like a distant vibration that refused to fade. A heavy silence settled over the check-in area, the kind that made everyone wait, not for an announcement but for someone, anyone, to break it. But no one moved, no one spoke. Only the distant voice of the PA system cut through the stillness, announcing a flight to Denver preparing for takeoff, as if the rest of the world kept moving, indifferent and untouched. Alyssa stood tall, arms relaxed at her sides, her gaze slowly scanning the faces of those around her, people who had witnessed everything, the invasive search, the denial of a solemn duty. Each set of eyes offered a different version of silence, some avoiding, some curious, a few quietly guilty. But still no one spoke, until a soft sigh broke through the stillness from behind. A tall man stepped out of the boarding line. His skin was deep brown, his posture upright, and he wore a faded olive cap embroidered with the words U.S. Marine Corps, veteran in red thread. Under its brim was a weathered face, lined and sun-worn, but his eyes were steady, the kind that had stood through storms without flinching. He walked toward Alyssa with no haste, no dramatic presence, only the quiet certainty of someone doing the one decent thing left to do in a place unraveling at its seams. "Excuse the interruption," he said, his voice low and resonant, forged in a chest familiar with the roar of chopper blades. "Name's Marcus Bellamy, Marine Corps, retired." He turned toward Savannah, then to the silent wall of security personnel behind her. "I've walked through more than 100 TSA checkpoints. In the 20 years since I got out, I've escorted fellow soldiers, buried family, and seen all kinds of protocol. But I've never seen anyone treated like this, especially not an officer on active military duty." Murmurs began rippling across the crowd like wind on still water. A few people inched closer. A middle-aged woman raised her phone and started recording. A teenager in a hoodie took out his earbuds and watched closely. The silence was shifting, not yet bold, but tinged with awareness, like the moment before a wave begins to rise. Marcus looked around, then back at Alyssa. I've stood in formation to salute fallen brothers under enemy fire. I know what honor looks like, and I also know what it feels like when that honor is insulted. It doesn't shout, it doesn't push, it just stands tall and looks you in the eye while you hide behind the word procedure. One of the security officers shifted slightly, unsure. Savannah stayed silent, biting her lower lip. In that moment, Marcus turned to the crowd behind him. More than 30 people, clustered in small groups, travelers waiting for flights, families saying goodbye, businessmen with rolling suitcases, all had seen what unfolded. A few phones were now raised. Some eyes moved from confusion to indignation, but still no one spoke. Marcus understood that hesitation well. He'd seen it in combat, when a young recruit froze after watching a comrade fall, too afraid to break formation. Not from cowardice, but because the human mind has limits. The line between right and safe, between wanting to speak and fearing being the next target. He turned back, lowered his voice just enough for Alyssa to hear. I can't let you stand here alone. Sometimes it takes one person to step forward before the whole line moves. Alyssa tilted her head slightly. For the first time that morning, she smiled. Not wide, not dramatic, but just enough. And to Marcus, that smile was worth more than any medal. He turned back to the counter, this time speaking louder. If you deny Colonel Morgan Borden today, you're not just rejecting a person. You're rejecting the very oath we signed in blood. A small voice answered from the crowd. That's right. A woman in a denim jacket pulled her mask down and turned her phone toward Marcus. A camera flash lit the space. A young man lifted his phone higher, going live. Savannah looked down at her keyboard. She didn't type, but her fingers moved nervously, as if trying to hide their trembling. No one from the airline staff stepped forward. No supervisor came. No manager intervened. But none of that mattered anymore, because the airport, a place built to move people, was slowly becoming a place where conscience began to move too. The air in the terminal was no longer filled with silent suspicion. It had become a fragile stillness, like a thin layer of ice stretched over deep water, ready to shatter with the next step. After Marcus Bellamy's words, the crowd's attention had shifted from passive curiosity to active witness. Phones weren't just recording, they were live streaming. Savannah still hadn't spoken. Her fingers, once pretending to type, had stopped completely. Beads of sweat gathered at her temples, despite the steady hum of airport air conditioning. Then, from the operations office behind the counter, a door opened. A man in his 60s stepped out, wearing a neatly buttoned white dress shirt, a light gray vest, and a steel-colored watch glinting at his wrist. His gait was deliberate, unhurried, each step exuding authority, as if nothing in this terminal could unfold beyond his control. The nameplate on his chest read, Don Watkins, Regional Operations Manager. He walked up behind Savannah, rested a hand on the counter, and spoke. No introductions, no pleasantries. His voice was low, not loud, but every word was clear and carried just enough force to reach Alyssa and Marcus. If you continue to disrupt the operations at this counter, we will have no choice but to request additional enforcement to remove you from the premises. Each word had been carefully chosen. Disrupt, enforcement, remove. None of them direct, but everyone understood their weight. It was a warning, a velvet-wrapped baton. Alyssa didn't respond immediately. She turned to face Don Watkins fully, her eyes landing first on his wristwatch, the kind worn by men who wield power but don't like leaving fingerprints. A second later, she looked up, her voice steady, not loud, but pressed with the weight of a generation that had been told to be quiet. "Additional enforcement," she repeated. "You might be right. If this continues, you may need more than airport security. Maybe the media. Maybe the Department of Defense. Or maybe Congress." That line made Watkins furrowed his brow, not out of fear, but recognition. He'd just confronted someone who wasn't the kind of woman who bowed when threatened. Alyssa held her gaze. She didn't blink, didn't back down. Her eyes didn't resist with rage. They demanded reflection with calm that made others feel their cowardice. "You have the right to call more personnel," she said, "but I have the right to ask. Why am I, the black military officer with complete documentation, the one considered a disruption to operations, while those who caused the delay stand unchallenged behind the desk?" Watkins tightened his jaw. Behind him, Marcus shifted slightly, arms folded, his eyes sharpened. A woman on a nearby bench whispered, "She's right," before covering her mouth. No one else spoke, but everyone heard. Alyssa continued, "I haven't yelled. I haven't caused a scene. I haven't overstepped my authority. I've asked about policy, and for that, I'm threatened with removal. Let's say it plainly. I'm being marked as the problem because I refuse to stay silent, the way you're used to people doing when you try to control them." Watkins said nothing. Savannah lowered her head further, her hands withdrawn from the keyboard. Reese, the officer who'd searched Alyssa earlier, stood still, arms crossed, more spectator than enforcer now. But his eyes told the real story. The eyes of a man once confident in the authority his uniform gave him, now watching it dim under the colder shadow of institutional command. Alyssa looked around. Every person in the waiting area was watching, not just watching her, but circling her like she was the anchor point for every buried definition of justice trying to resurface. Her eyes stopped on a boy about 13, sitting next to his mother, filming with his phone. His skin was brown like hers. She wondered, is he thinking, if I grow up and wear this uniform, will I be seen as a threat, too? She turned back, her voice dropping, not sharper, but more pleading, almost mournful. "How many times a day do you call for backup instead of calling on your reason? How many people like me get labeled as disruptive simply because we refuse to step back into the role of the victim?" Watkins didn't answer. He stepped back, nodded slightly, not an admission of guilt, but an acknowledgement of a problem. He turned toward the office and left behind a final hollow phrase, "I'll escalate this to upper management," and the door closed behind him, not gently, but like a sealed trap, letting nothing in. But what had already escaped could no longer be contained. Alyssa stood still, but inside, she knew this wasn't just her fight anymore. The atmosphere had changed, and what was coming would not be silenced by an apology or managed by a press release. The soft roll of luggage wheels brushed across the stone floor, then stopped. A pair of low black shoes with silver trim at the heels appeared, cutting through the crowd. Behind them was a small, composed figure. Each step she took thudded softly, like solemn drum beats marking a slow procession through the terminal. She wore a long-sleeved black dress, high at the collar, made from modest fabric but ironed with care. A matching black chiffon scarf was wrapped neatly around her head. She said nothing. She didn't push, didn't ask for space, but somehow the crowd parted on its own, clearing a path for her. Alyssa recognized her instantly. Months had passed since Elijah's graduation, but that face, the deep brown eyes, the lightly lined skin weathered by time but never weakened, was unmistakable. Clara Ward, Elijah's mother. She stopped just a few steps from Alyssa, saying nothing. But her eyes, neither pleading nor angry, cast a silence over the terminal heavier than any argument. Alyssa felt her throat tighten. She stepped forward, ready to greet her, but Clara raised her hand gently, signaling that no words were needed. She turned her gaze toward the check-in counter, where Savannah still stood frozen, and then to the security officers who hadn't yet stepped away. And then, with a voice not loud but clear enough to cut through every barrier, Clara spoke. "I told my son, if the day ever came when he gave his life, this country would honor him." No one interrupted. Even the airport announcement seemed to pause. "I told Elijah that America wasn't perfect, but it was a place that didn't forget those who served. I told him that wearing the uniform was noble, that he would be respected not just while alive, but even more so when laid to rest." She lifted her chin, eyes dry but sharp as steel. "But if this is how you welcome him home, searched like a criminal, blocked like a thief, silenced before you even explain, then I was wrong." The air vents whistled quietly above the rows of waiting seats. No one moved. No one dared cough. A young woman pulled out her phone, not to film, but to wipe away her tears. Alyssa stood still, her posture upright, but her fist clenched slightly at her side. Her emotions didn't surface as tears, they burned, slow and deep, beneath her skin. She saw Elijah again in her mind, walking into boot camp for the first time, his backpack nearly swallowing him whole, his legs unsure, but his eyes bright like a rising sun. "I just want to do something that makes my mom proud, Colonel. Nothing big, just once." He stumbled through his first rifle test, failed navigation drills 3 weeks in a row, but he didn't quit. He learned to try again. He learned to endure. He learned to push past not just his doubt, but the doubt of those who believed kids like him didn't belong in uniform. Then, one day, during his first promotion ceremony, it was Alyssa who pinned the insignia to his chest, looked him in the eye, and said, "You don't need to be great to make someone proud. You just need to not turn your back on what's right." Now, standing in front of his mother, hearing that memory echo again, Alyssa understood. What was happening today wasn't just covert racism, it was a public disgrace. Not just to her, but to Elijah, to Clara, to every person who ever believed in the honor of the uniform. She stepped forward and stood beside Clara, shoulder to shoulder. Neither of them spoke. But in that moment, 2 black women, one in uniform, one in mourning, standing tall in the middle of a crowded airport, said more than any apology or press release ever could. No one heard Clara's footsteps as she stepped back to let Alyssa take the lead. The entire terminal seemed to freeze in place, and then a voice rang out, not from the check-in counter, not from the overhead speakers, but from a corner of the waiting area to the right. "If even an escorting officer gets turned away, then who's left to be respected?" The voice was male, deep, and sharp, like thunder cracking through clear skies. All eyes turned toward the middle-aged black man who had spoken. He wore a white dress shirt, his tie slightly loosened, a company badge clipped to the side of his backpack, probably a business traveler. But his eyes no longer looked toward his flight. They were locked on Savannah and the staff behind the counter. A young man in a hoodie nearby glanced around, then raised his phone and began recording. Across from him, a young woman had already been filming for minutes, but now she stood. Something had ignited inside her. Brianna Lopez, 25, Latina, hair pulled high, eyes fierce beneath thick mascara. She stood tall, her phone live streaming straight toward the counter. Her voice shook slightly but didn't break. "You're all watching a black female officer being denied the right to escort her fallen comrade, even though she has every document, every clearance, and no violations. If you still think this is just a misunderstanding, look at how they stay silent." A TSA officer turned toward her as if to speak, but the crowd cut him off with a growing murmur. The outrage didn't erupt as one loud scream. It came as a chorus of disbelief. "This is unreal. She's military. This is a straight-up racism." A harmony of protest building, beat by beat. Brianna kept going. Now, no longer just reporting, but confessing. My dad was a soldier. He used to say, black folks get caught up because they lose control too easily. And I believed him. I used to think black people were more aggressive because I was taught that by a soldier. Silence fell. No one interrupted. No one looked away. She lowered the phone slightly, her eyes moist. But today I see a woman, calm, respectful, full of dignity, being treated like a threat, not because of what she's done, but because of the color of her skin. And I know now what I believed was wrong, deeply wrong. A visible shift flickered across many faces in the terminal. Not everyone empathized, but people were thinking, for the first time, not about missed flights, but about how many times they'd stayed silent. The hashtag #LetHerFly began to appear. A young woman sitting near the gate typed into her Instagram story, "I'm at Houston Airport watching a black female colonel being denied permission to escort her fallen soldier. No clear reason, no apology. What is happening to this country?" Meanwhile, Brianna's Twitter post went live. "This is why we speak up. Hashtag let her fly. Hashtag justice for her and him." Within 3 minutes, the hashtag trended locally in Houston. Within 5, veterans and journalists started tweeting, "Who's there? Who has footage?" A boy around 10 tugged on his father's sleeve. "Dad, is she the bad guy?" The father shook his head, his eyes fixed on Alyssa, still standing beside her suitcase, chin high, calm, unshaken. "No, son, she's just a brave person being treated wrong." From another corner, Marcus Bellamy took a slow, deliberate step forward. He didn't say a word, but by simply standing beside Alyssa, tall, firm, like a silent monument, he said everything. Alyssa looked around. Phones still streaming, voices still rising, truth still being recorded in real time. But her eyes no longer held solitude. She knew the warning had been delivered, and this time it didn't come from just an officer. It came from a community that had finally awakened. The wave of outrage was no longer a scattering of individual voices. It had become a tidal swell of indignation. Phones were held high, hashtags about Alyssa's case spreading faster than news of delayed flights. The crowd, once a sea of passive travelers, had transformed into witnesses, documentarians, and questionnaires. And just as it all seemed on the verge of breaking wide open, a familiar voice rang out, this time stripped of its earlier calm. Craig Henders, the security officer who had led the initial search, stepped back toward the counter. His voice rose louder than before, cracking slightly under pressure, but trying to hold its authoritative edge. "We haven't done anything wrong. This is the required procedure. Airport security policy demands additional checks when there are inconsistencies. You're all being misled by emotion, but we operate by the rules." A few airport staff behind him nodded reflexively. Savannah Miller, the agent who had denied Alyssa, remained frozen at her station, her eyes glued to the keyboard, fingers gripping the edge of the desk so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Henders raised his voice further, almost shouting now. "This isn't discrimination. It's the system. It's protocol. And we're just doing our job." Alyssa hadn't moved, but as soon as the phrase "just following protocol" left his mouth, she calmly stepped forward. Just one step, but enough to silence the entire space in front of the counter. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her eyes carried a language only those who've faced impossible situations truly know, fierce in their composure. She spoke evenly. "If you're truly following protocol, then I'd suggest you reread Section 22, Chapter 4 of the FAA's Special Passenger Coordination Manual, last revised in 2023. No one answered. She lifted her chin slightly, eyes locked on Henders. "I review it every year, because my job requires me to know it. And I'll remind you, Section 22, Chapter 4, clearly states, an officer assigned to escort the remains of a fallen service member is entitled to priority boarding without the requirement of extended justification or special verification unless a clear security threat is identified. She paused, letting each word drop into the terminal like stones in still water. I am not a threat. I have not resisted. I carry no contraband. I am simply here, fulfilling the duty this country entrusted to me. All background noise seemed to fade. The same staff who had nodded along with Henders now exchanged glances, uncertain, exposed. A man in a suit at the ticket counter subtly stepped back, as if trying to ease himself out of the frame. Alyssa continued, now no longer explaining but demanding accountability. If you're following the rules, why is no one here willing to read them aloud to me? No reply. If you truly understand protocol, why can none of you speak to me directly, instead of hiding behind empty phrases like security policy? And if this system doesn't discriminate, why am I, the black woman in uniform, the only one detained, searched, and denied, while others with the same paperwork passed through without issue? This time, a few people clapped, not loudly, just a series of sharp snaps echoing with validation. An older white woman clasped her hands together with her husband and whispered, "She's right. The silence is what's scariest." The young man in the hoodie held his phone higher. The screen's glow reflected off Alyssa's cheekbones, illuminating the fine lines near her eyes. Traces of age, yes, but also marks of lived truth. Alyssa lowered her voice, nearly a whisper, but clear enough to be heard. Sometimes, the blade doesn't lie in the action. It lies in how people describe the action as if they had no choice. I haven't lost control. I don't need pity. I'm just doing what's right. And if this system feels threatened by one person doing what's right, then maybe the system needs to look at itself. A beat of silence. Then someone in the crowd whispered, "Now that's a colonel." Alyssa didn't smile. She didn't nod. She simply turned and stepped back behind Clara Ward. But her eyes stayed locked on the counter, as if to say that while she'd said her piece, she was still ready to speak again. Not to convince, but to remind everyone that dignity does not retreat. The atmosphere at Terminal C of Houston Airport was no longer that of a place awaiting commercial flights. It had become an unofficial courtroom where stares replaced evidence, phones replaced paperwork, and justice was being tried through millions of shares. Alyssa's last words had torn through the mask worn by the entire system operating behind that counter. Henders stepped back, his face flushed as if caught exposed on camera, while Savannah remained completely silent, her fingers no longer typing, just clutching the edge of the desk like it was the last piece of ground beneath a collapsing flood. Then came a new sound, not from the loudspeakers, not from the crowd. A camera clicked to life. A middle-aged white man in a light blue shirt, loosened tie, and shoulder-mounted camera stepped forward from the far end of the terminal. Beside him was an Asian American woman holding a microphone, eyes wide with surprise but quickly shifting to professional poise. Local news station, ABC Houston. They hadn't been called. The crew was at the airport to cover a new flight route to Mexico City. But when the crowd began to swell and phrases like human rights, fallen soldier, and denied because of skin color echoed through the terminal, instinct pulled them closer. And now the camera was rolling. The mic was aimed straight at Alyssa. "We're reporting live from Houston Airport, where a U.S. Army colonel has allegedly been denied the right to escort the remains of a fellow soldier for reasons now under scrutiny. What you're seeing here has raised questions for many. Is this still the country we claim to be? One that honors its servicemen and women?" A red banner flashed across the handheld monitor. Breaking news. The heat spread like oil catching fire. Within 5 minutes, a veteran-run Twitter account had reposted the live feed with the caption, "I never thought America was perfect, but at least we didn't humiliate our dead. Today, I'm not so sure." 4 minutes later, a social affairs journalist from NBC added the hashtags. Then came a major black community page from Atlanta, reposting a still of Alyssa being searched in the middle of the crowd with a blunt caption. "Searched for skin color, not for wrongdoing. As American as it gets." Everything exploded. With every passing minute came tens of thousands more views, comments, and waves of outrage. But amid the media storm, Alyssa stood still, saying nothing more. Not because she was out of words, but because at that moment she was listening to something else. The quiet roar inside her, where belief and betrayal collided like tectonic plates under one country. Alyssa had loved America with clear-eyed reason. She had sworn to serve, to fight, to sacrifice, not because everything here was right, but because she believed that doing right could help make the country worthy of the freedom it claimed. She had once thought some things needed to be quietly fixed from the inside. She had seen too much pain ignored and had clung to the idea that not everyone was part of the problem, that if we exposed too much ugliness, people would lose hope. But today, in this very public place, in front of children learning their first lessons in justice, in front of Elijah's friends, in front of mothers who would one day bury sons, silence was no longer a moral option. It wasn't the image of America that was decaying under scrutiny. It was the belief that wrongdoing could go unchecked forever, simply because no one had the courage to speak. Alyssa raised her head and looked directly into the camera. She didn't straighten her uniform. She didn't wipe the sweat on her brow. She let every wrinkle show, let the shimmer of exhaustion gleam openly on her temples, let the fatigue in her eyes speak as an unspoken challenge to all watching. "If anyone out there finds this uncomfortable," she said, for the first time addressing the lens, "then remember, it's uncomfortable for me too, living in a country where people still have to fight just to do what's right." Silence gripped the air. Then, applause broke from the left side of the terminal, not thunderous, but enough to pull others with it. Group by group, people stood and clapped. They didn't chant. They didn't shout. They just clapped, steady, firm. A single heartbeat rising for all the things that had gone unspoken for far too long. After the applause rippled through the terminal, silence returned. This time, not with fear or hesitation, but with anticipation. No one left. No one turned away. Everyone understood that the most powerful part of the truth wasn't over. It had only just begun. Then, as if summoned from a remote layer of corporate detachment, a man emerged from an internal airline door. He wore a deep navy suit, matching tie, and shoes polished to the kind of mirror shine that only happens right before stepping in front of a camera. His nameplate gleamed. Kyle Armstrong, Regional Operations Director, Atlantic Sky. His face was all professionalism, but his eyes couldn't quite mask the disorientation. Kyle strode quickly toward the counter, lips curling into a courteous smile, the kind learned in crisis management workshops, not from personal conviction. He raised his hand gently, like a speaker trying to calm a conference room during a projector malfunction. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm a representative from Atlantic Sky Corporate. First, on behalf of the company, I'd like to apologize for the inconvenience experienced here today." Alyssa didn't move. No nod, no reaction. Kyle continued, his voice neutral, as if reading from a script. "This incident resulted from a verification error and does not reflect the core values of our airline. To address it, we will be conducting a full internal review and, in the meantime..." He paused, adjusted his tie, then turned to Alyssa, tone now dipped in formality. "Colonel Morgan, we deeply regret the unfortunate experience you've had. As a gesture of goodwill and respect, the airline would like to upgrade you to first class on your flight today. 1 beat of silence. Cameras still rolling, eyes still watching. Alyssa slowly turned her head toward Kyle. Her gaze wasn't angry. It was hollow. So hollow, it reflected more truth than any reprimand. She stepped forward, each movement deliberate, like she was walking over the very emptiness that had just been offered to her. She stopped a few feet from Kyle, stood tall, and spoke, not loudly, not with flair, but with the steel of midnight-forged metal. You just apologized to everyone, but the one who was humiliated, degraded, treated as a threat, you didn't even say her name. The words shattered the fragile glass of corporate damage control. She didn't let him respond, just kept going, her voice pouring into the silence like clear water over stone. I don't need a first-class seat. I don't need complimentary wine or a towel folded twice. What I need is to be recognized for who I am. Not because I'm a colonel, but because I'm a human being. The terminal fell utterly still. Kyle straightened, his face locked in a rigid mask. A woman near the boarding gate dabbed her eyes with a tissue. The young man in the hoodie whispered, "She just taught an entire airline how to apologize." Alyssa looked at Kyle, then over to the staff behind the counter, Savannah, Henders, and those who had watched in silence throughout. A real apology doesn't begin with "we" and end with "inconvenience." A real apology comes from a place where people stop hiding behind procedure. It begins with ownership, and if you can't even name the harm, don't assume you can fix it with a better seat. With that, she turned and walked back toward Clara. Her shoulders remained straight. Her stride was steady. She hadn't won an argument. She had forced a system to confront itself. Kyle Armstrong bowed his head, but no one saw understanding. What they saw was a man who'd just realized that not every crisis can be smoothed over with perks. In that crowded terminal, when no one argued back, dignity spoke the loudest. And that day, Alyssa Morgan didn't need to be upgraded to first class, because she stood in a place no leather seat could ever reach, the place of what is right. Amid the noise slowly breaking into clusters of people, still recording, whispering, or trading glances, Alyssa slipped into a moment of stillness, like the surface of a pond after an unexpected summer rain. Everything around her, the airport announcements, the foot traffic, the clacking of keyboards, began to fade. For a heartbeat, the only thing that existed was the sound of her own breath, syncing with the deep rhythm of her pulse beneath the fabric of a uniform worn down by years, but never by purpose. And then, like an old reel clicking back into motion, Elijah appeared. Not Elijah, draped in the flag. Elijah was 18, had just transferred from boot camp to Fort Jackson, name tag pinned crookedly to his sleeve, laces untied, uncertain of how to wear the uniform he had yet to grow into. Alyssa remembered that day clearly. The southern summer scorched the training ground, sunlight falling on the base like a trial by fire. Elijah had been the last one on the obstacle course, fumbling at the rope climb, hands trembling as he gripped the thick, scratchy rope, his shirt soaked with sweat. Each time he slipped, he'd stop, breathe deep, and go again, palms raw and bleeding. The others had finished. Some watched him with smirks. A few snickered, not loud, but just enough for Alyssa to hear. Another black kid who's gonna quit halfway. It wasn't a new sentence. It had echoed across U.S. military bases for decades, hidden in pitying nods, in compliments laced with limitations, and in glances that never needed names. Glances Alyssa knew too well from her early days in uniform. She had been Elijah once. She too had trembled through her first training, heard the quiet doubts. You don't have to push so hard. You're not like the others. She had endured years where merit wasn't measured by effort, but by how well she could swallow silence. Every promotion had been a victory, not over competitors, but over expectation. That's why she hadn't offered Elijah a pep talk that day. She'd simply walked to the base of the rope, stood beneath him, and said just one thing. Nobody remembers the fastest to climb, but the one who refuses to quit, they're never forgotten. Elijah had looked down, sweat streaking his temples. He didn't smile, just nodded, and then climbed again. Not shouting, not with any dramatic flair, just steadily, stubbornly. And when he reached the top, his body shook with exhaustion, but his eyes, at that moment, were brighter than any sun over that training ground. That memory felt like yesterday, but now that boy lay in a flag-draped casket, and the woman who once stood beneath his rope, catching his determined gaze, now stood in a crowded airport terminal, defending his dignity with a different kind of strength, quiet, unrelenting, unshakable, because no one, dead or alive, deserved to be diminished simply because the world hadn't learned to associate black names with honor. Alyssa turned back toward the counter. She looked at Savannah, still avoiding eye contact, and saw a reflection of herself 2 decades ago, a young woman, unsure how to say this is wrong, but with just enough silence to allow the wrong to continue. And then she saw something else, that if she chose silence today, if she accepted that first-class seat, if she let that generic apology cover the truth, Elijah and others like him would be shoved down that rope again, not because they were weak, but because no one waited for them to climb. Alyssa drew a long breath, not to steady herself, but as a vow to weld that resolve even tighter. Not even death could strip Elijah of his dignity. And no machine, no system wrapped in titles and protocol would force her into complicity. She turned to Clara, who still stood beside her, face calm but solid as stone. Alyssa placed a hand gently on her shoulder, gave it a firm squeeze. Not a word spoken, just a promise. A promise that Elijah would not make this last journey alone. And even though there were no bugles, no honor guard, no flags raised in this terminal, every step Alyssa had taken today, every word, every look that refused to lower, was in itself a ceremony of honor for her former cadet. Clara stood silently beside Alyssa, hands clasped in front of her, mourning veil draped across her shoulders like a layer of quiet shadow, too deep for others to see. She hadn't said a word since her one clear statement, when everyone else still clung to the fiction of procedure. But inside her, waves were still rising, strong, quiet, and unstoppable. When Kyle Armstrong stepped out, Clara had watched him from afar. The way he walked, the way he held the mic, the way he addressed everyone instead of saying the name of the one who'd been humiliated. And when he spoke of a seat upgrade as a form of apology, she understood everything. They hadn't come to apologize, they had come to erase the evidence. In her eyes, an apology only meant something if it carried truth, not evasion. And the fact that not one of the people behind the counter could look Alyssa in the eye, not one dared speak a word directly to her. The mother of a dead son, the mother sending off her child's spirit, was a wordless form of contempt. Clara wasn't easily angered. She had lived her whole life in silence, in patience, choosing dignity over weeping. But today, right here, she felt something within her crack, not because her son was gone, but because even in death, there were still those who believed a black mother's grief could be pacified with a first-class ticket and a few lines of damage-controlled contrition. She didn't carry a rank like Alyssa. She didn't wear a uniform, didn't have a massive social media following, or millions watching to apply pressure. But she had one thing, the unwavering belief that no one had the right to trample someone else's dignity without consequence. She looked down at her plain black shoes, then lifted her gaze, meeting Alyssa's eyes. This woman was no blood relative, yet she had stood like a wall, shielding against the wind, against judgment against an entire system to preserve the honor of Elijah's name. And in that moment, Clara understood one thing with piercing clarity. If the airline thought they could bury racial discrimination beneath a business-class upgrade, if they believed the pain of a black family could be softened with a phrase like, "We apologize for the inconvenience," then they had chosen the wrong women to confront. The air in the terminal was still holding its breath. From behind the security gate, steady, deliberate footsteps echoed, not rushed, but heavy enough to draw the entire murmuring space into a hush. A man in a black military uniform entered, each step sharp, like a parade march across an invisible battlefield. His uniform bore a special insignia from the Department of Defense, 2 rows of silver buttons polished to mirror the airport lights. A black keepy sat at an angle on his head, the eagle crest gleaming gold at the center of his brow. He carried no weapon, issued no booming commands, but his presence turned every eye toward him. Some airport staff instinctively straightened their backs, others stepped out of his path. One officer murmured, barely audible, "Major Beckett." He didn't stop, didn't scan the crowd. His direction was precise from the beginning. The woman standing in the center of it all, uniform still sharp despite nearly 2 hours of interrogation, scrutiny, and humiliation. Colonel Alyssa Morgan. When he reached her, he stopped like a monument planted in the earth. "Colonel Morgan," he said, voice deep but controlled, carrying clearly to every corner, "I'm Thomas Beckett, here on behalf of the Department of Defense. I've been dispatched to take over command of the situation regarding your escort mission." He produced a military identification card and unfolded a slim leather portfolio containing an official order, stamped in red from the Army Command. By special directive issued under emergency protocol, Beckett declared, "Colonel Alyssa Morgan and the remains of Private Elijah Ward will be transported via private military aircraft, dispatched by the Department of Defense. The plane is now ready at runway C, secure and isolated." Silence. Savannah nearly collapsed behind the counter, her hand slipping off the desk. Henders clenched his jaw, but no words came. Kyle Armstrong, who had offered a first-class seat just minutes before, stood paralyzed, as if someone had frozen the very nerve endings responsible for reaction. Alyssa didn't speak right away. She met Beckett's eyes, not out of doubt, but to confirm what she had long hoped be, that justice had finally entered the room, not in the form of a threat, but in the form of duty, honor, and rightful authority. "I'm ready," she said, quietly, without ceremony. Beckett nodded, a gesture that was more than acknowledgement. It was a silent pledge that neither she nor the soldier she carried would endure another second of indignity. Clara stood beside her, clutching her small leather purse. When she heard the words military aircraft, she didn't cry, but her eyes, those resolute, dignified eyes, finally glistened for the first time since she had stepped into the terminal. Not because they were being prioritized, but because her son, now lying still beneath a flag, was finally being treated in accordance with the weight of his sacrifice. Marcus Bellamy stepped forward and laid a hand on Alyssa's shoulder. He said nothing. He didn't have to. In his weathered gaze there was complete reverence, not for the rank, but for the integrity. A woman in the crowd leaned toward her friend and whispered, "They tried to keep her down," but she made the whole system stand at attention. The cameras whirred louder. Reporters from ABC, NBC, and independent outlets zoomed in on Beckett, but he didn't answer a single question. As journalists tried to crowd forward, he said only one thing. "Right now, our mission is to bring a fallen soldier home and honor the one still standing. The rest of your questions should be directed at the ones who stood behind that counter." Beckett turned to Alyssa, giving a slight nod. "Colonel, Mrs. Ward, please follow me to the transport vehicle. The flight crew is ready." Alyssa nodded, but before she moved, she turned back. Her gaze swept slowly across the terminal. A space that just an hour ago had been a chamber of suspicion smirks, and coordinated silence. Now, it had become a small monument to a kind of belief reclaimed from the grip of prejudice. She turned again and took a step toward the crowd. Not quickly, not for show, but with full intention as someone who knows a chapter must be closed with gratitude, not just resolution. She saw Marcus Bellamy first, still standing tall, his eyes steady, just as they'd been when he became the first to break through the wall of silence. Alyssa gave a small nod. "Mr. Bellamy," she said, her voice not loud but carrying, "thank you for being the first to speak. I've grown used to fighting alone, but today, because of you, I remembered no one should have to stand alone to defend what's right." Marcus simply nodded, his weathered hand tightening around the brim of his cap. He said nothing, but his eyes, red from age and emotion, spoke clearly. "We see each other." She turned to Brianna Lopez, who was still holding her phone close to her chest as if guarding something more precious than the footage she'd captured. Alyssa stepped closer, just slightly, then smiled. Not the kind of smile meant to ease tension, but one with depth, where belief shone clean through, washed away doubt. "Ms. Lopez," Alyssa said, "thank you for admitting you were once wrong. People always say it takes courage to speak out, but I believe it takes even more courage to admit a mistake and try to make it right." Brianna was caught off guard. Her eyes were red, but her lips pressed tight, nodding repeatedly as if holding back something that threatened to spill over. Around them, the phones had lowered. No one was filming now. They were listening. Alyssa turned to face the larger crowd, the ones who had turned around, who had clapped, who had said she's right when doubt still hung in the air. "I know what happened just now made some of you feel hurt, maybe ashamed. I know some of you are thinking, I should have spoken up sooner. But don't blame yourselves. Justice doesn't come from one voice. It comes from the right voices rising together at the right time." She paused, letting the weight settle. "I may wear the rank. I may know the FAA code by heart. I may stand up to a system. But none of that matters if people don't speak, if the voices don't rise together, in sync with purpose." Her eyes moved across each face, one by one. From the older woman who had called out truth like a verdict, to the young boy who had asked his mother, "Is she a hero?" to the quiet passengers who had simply nodded in silence. "Thank you," Alyssa said softly, for not looking away. Because sometimes, the only way to protect dignity is to not let it be stepped on without someone saying its name. No one spoke, but in that silence, deep, still, resonant, was the loudest applause she had ever received. Beckett stepped beside her again, his eyes saying what didn't need to be voiced. "It's time." Alyssa turned once more, but this time she left nothing behind. Only ordinary people, standing a little straighter, and for the first time, not to wait for their flights, but to hold space for something far greater: justice. As Alyssa and Clara began walking toward the private gate that led to the tarmac where the military aircraft awaited, Major Beckett remained behind at the counter. He turned to face the airport staff. His face still held the sternness of a senior officer, but his eyes carried something colder, something none of them dared meet. The crowd hadn't dispersed. Phones were still recording, but no one was filming out of curiosity anymore. They were staying because they understood they were witnessing something more than a PR crisis. This was reckoning. Beckett scanned the line, past Kyle Armstrong, now visibly unraveling after watching every attempt at damage control disintegrate, past Savannah, frozen behind the counter, her face pale and hollow. And then he fixed his gaze on Craig Henders, the security officer who had ordered Alyssa to be searched like a criminal in front of hundreds of strangers. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "What happened here today," Beckett said, "will not be classified as a mistake." No one moved. No one asked why. They all knew. If it were called a mistake, that would mean it was forgivable, repeatable. Beckett would not allow that. "We are treating this as evidence." evidence. Evidence of how a system chose to ignore a person's dignity. Evidence of how a sacred military duty was tarnished by prejudice and cowardice. He paused. His stare cut through uniforms, slicing into the excuses beneath. And the Department of Defense will pursue this to the end. The final line landed like a sentence. No gavel needed, no court required, but everyone in that terminal knew. An era had ended. The one where racism could hide behind special procedures and walk away clean. Kyle Armstrong swallowed hard, fingers tightening around his clipboard until his knuckles turned white. He tried to speak, but failed. For the first time in his corporate career, he realized his authority had nowhere left to anchor. The internal reports, the drafted public apologies, the process reviews, tools once used to sedate public outrage, meant nothing against the weight of a uniform that carried real consequence. Savannah Miller, who had once smirked and denied Alyssa like she was just following orders, now stood motionless, shoulders trembling. She'd assumed this would pass quietly, like so many other incidents. But in front of her was an image no press release could erase. A grieving mother in mourning black, and a colonel escorting her soldier, while she remained frozen in a place where mediocrity had been mistaken for professionalism. Henders didn't speak, but everyone saw his hand fall away from his belt. He no longer stood with the posture of constant alert. His back was slightly hunched, his gaze unsettled. A man who once believed his badge was armor now stood among the crowd like a man awaiting judgment. From the crowd, an older white woman finally spoke. The one being escorted today was supposed to be a soul, but turns out the real corpses are the ones still walking. A few clapped, then more, then the whole terminal. But it wasn't celebratory. It was a collective acknowledgement of a truth spoken aloud, one too long buried in polite silence. Online, Beckett's statement was shared millions of times within the hour. Veteran groups called it one of the proudest moments for the U.S. military since Iraq. Journalists wrote, "True authority doesn't shout. It just needs the right person to stand." But inside the airport, there were no headlines, just eyes, just people who had once stood in silence, now remembering, and those who once dominated the narrative, now bowing their heads to a truth they could no longer spin. Clara looked at Beckett and gave a small nod, not out of gratitude, but as an acknowledgement that today her grief had been spoken in the language of justice. No one apologized to her. She didn't need it, because the truth had been restored to its rightful place, and her son, her soldier, was not sent off in silence but with an oath reaffirmed through action. Alyssa turned for one last glance before passing through the private gate. What she saw wasn't a chaotic airline or a broken airport. It was an old world collapsing, making way for something more honest to begin. As Alyssa stepped onto the military aircraft, the late afternoon sun spilled across the silver hull, casting a narrow ribbon of light along the tarmac like a farewell banner. Clara walked beside her, small in frame but unshakable, fingering the edge of her morning dress as if holding on to the last thread of a son who never got the chance to fully become. Ahead of them, Elijah's flag-draped coffin rested with solemn precision in the transport bay, flanked by soldiers standing at attention, saluting in the sacred ritual reserved for heroes coming home. No one spoke, but it was the silence itself that made the moment unbearably sacred. A photograph captured that exact moment. Alyssa and Clara walking toward the aircraft, heads high, grief cloaked in dignity. Taken by an ABC Houston photojournalist, the image spread across the internet like a wave breaking through every political headline and entertainment blurb. Within an hour of being posted, it was everywhere. On Twitter, the hashtag #LetHerFly surged to the #1 national trend, staying there for 16 straight hours. People weren't just sharing the photo, they were quoting Alyssa's words, Clara's tears, Marcus Bellamy's steady defiance, and Brianna Lopez' trembling but unshakable voice of awakening. Major veteran organizations like Veterans for Justice, Unity Among Ranks, and the Army Honor Advisory Board released statements in unison. A public petition titled "Restore Dignity to Those Who Serve" was launched and garnered over 800,000 signatures in less than 24 hours. Formerly silent service members began recounting long-buried stories, being passed over for promotion, profiled at security, addressed by abbreviations instead of rank, as if Alyssa's ordeal had unearthed a national nerve long left untouched. Mainstream media dove in head first. CNN ran a special report with the headline, "A First-Class Seat Can't Patch a National Shame." The New York Times published a 3,000-word analysis titled "Colonel Alyssa Morgan and the Blow to the Illusion of Fairness in American Air Travel." The Washington Post dropped all euphemism. Dignity doesn't need permission. But what made the issue inescapable was the arrival of institutional power. The NAACP and Military Family Rights Watch, two of the most respected advocacy organizations in the nation, issued a formal complaint to the U.S. Department of Transportation and the FAA, demanding a federal investigation into Atlantic Sky Airlines and staff at Houston Intercontinental Airport. Their language was blunt, not a mistake, not an unfortunate incident. They called it a systemic, deliberate, and prolonged act of discrimination. Their statement read, "When a black woman colonel escorting the remains of a fallen soldier is treated as a threat, not for what she's done, but for who she is, that is not a misunderstanding. It is the product of an environment where suspicion and contempt are allowed to thrive under the mask of protocol." That statement went viral within hours, often paired with the video of Alyssa invoking FAA Section 22, Chapter 4, her voice crisp and unshaken, like a masterclass in human rights delivered in real time. For Atlantic Sky, the fallout was swift and brutal. Their official social media pages were flooded with backlash, one-star reviews, screenshots of canceled tickets, and the now viral hashtag #NeverFlyingAtlantic. On Instagram, customers posted clips of themselves tearing up boarding passes, while a mega-influencer with over 5 million followers shared a post that read, "You can forget towels, you can forget meals, but if you forget human dignity, you can forget existing." Media coverage turned investigative. Reporters dug up past lawsuits, refusals to accommodate passengers with disabilities, delayed responses to verbal abuse against people of color, and asked why no one had been held accountable until now. The crisis reached inside the company. Monica Keller, Atlantic Sky's director of communications, resigned that very afternoon. Her resignation email, later leaked, read, "I was trained to protect a brand. I was not trained to be complicit. I can rebuild a company's image after a crisis, but I cannot rebuild the self-respect that was willingly abandoned." The following morning, the airline released a short, sterile press statement confirming the suspension of 4 employees pending investigation. Though names weren't listed, it was widely confirmed that Savannah Miller and Craig Henders were among them. But the statement did little to quiet the storm. On NPR, a caller put it bluntly, "They suspended staff not because they felt guilty, but because they feared revenue loss." The conversation had shifted. It was no longer about what happened. It was about who it happened to and what she represented. Alyssa Morgan became the center of essays, analysis, and personal reflections. People called her the woman of truth, the return of honor in uniform, the one who carried dignity for the silent. Yet, Alyssa made no public comment, no interviews, no press conferences, no posts, and that silence made her presence even louder. Because sometimes the truth doesn't need to be repeated. It only needs to be carved into the world through action. That evening, during a private meeting at the Georgia base where Elijah's burial was to take place, a reporter approached Clara and asked, after everything, did she accept the airline's apology? Clara looked the journalist square in the eye, not with bitterness, not with anger, but with unwavering clarity, and said, I don't need them to apologize to me. I need them to remember and change. That line and the photo that followed, a black mother in mourning, standing amid a crowd, spread like fire across social media. No one asked anything more, because everyone understood it was a message sharp enough to strike the conscience of a country. 3 weeks after the media firestorm, before public attention could even begin to settle, the U.S. Congress convened a special session on the matter of honoring dignity in civilianized military missions. It wasn't the kind of hearing dramatized for television, with raised voices or political posturing, but a chamber of stillness, so solemn that the scratch of a pen echoed like a drumbeat signaling a shift that would not be reversed. Proposal number 4735 was placed on the table before the Armed Services and Transportation Committee, the Ward Military Transport Respect Act, a law named after a young soldier, Private Elijah Ward, who now lay still beneath a flag, even as his story was rewriting the nation's understanding of what it means to respect those who serve. The first to rise was Congressman James Holloway, a former Marine who had watched fellow soldiers die on Iraqi soil. His voice wasn't loud, but it was steady, like a wooden stake driven deep into a rushing river. We cannot allow those who gave their lives for this country to be treated like misroaded baggage, and we damn sure can't allow those still living, carrying out honorable duties, to be treated like a disruption just because of their skin. No one objected. No one was delayed. And, for the first time in nearly a year, a bill addressing systemic bias received near unanimous support across party lines. Because this truth no longer lived in policy briefs, it had moved through the lens of every smartphone, through Alyssa's unflinching gaze, through Clara's trembling but unshaken voice, through every live stream captured in that airport terminal. The bill mandated that all commercial airlines under federal contract undergo compulsory training in racial awareness and the handling of military escort protocols. Airports were required to establish dedicated reception lanes for escorting officers. The FAA and Department of Defense would jointly oversee implementation. It wasn't just ink on paper. It was a declaration that dignity was no longer up for negotiation at the check-in counter. On the day the law was signed, a small ceremony took place at the Pentagon. No red carpet, no grand applause. But when a framed copy of the act was placed beside a black and white photo of Elijah in uniform, everyone in the room understood they were witnessing one of those rare moments when a government didn't just react, but truly learned from its people. Alyssa did not speak, but she was there, standing in uniform at the front, not as a symbol, but as a witness to a nation growing up, forced to stare into the mirror and finally see the wounds it had let fester. When Elijah's name was spoken, she tilted her head slightly. Her eyes held no sorrow, only pride. The same quiet pride she'd seen in him when he reached the top of that rope for the first time, his grip bleeding but his will shining brighter than the summer sun. After the ceremony ended and the room cleared out, Alyssa remained a moment longer. She stood before the encased act, reaching out to touch the glass, not to feel the object, but to listen to the heartbeat of a past now preserved in federal law. A familiar voice spoke beside her, Beckett, as precise as the day he'd walked into that airport. This is how a soldier makes history, Alyssa, not with a weapon, but with unshakable silence. Alyssa smiled faintly. She didn't need another medal. But this moment proved that the beliefs she had held, once doubted, had been etched into law not as promises, but as policy. What moved her most wasn't the act itself, but the faces behind it. The young, the veterans, the once complicit, all now standing shoulder to shoulder, defending something that should have never needed defending in the first place. On the drive back to base, Alyssa looked out the window of the military vehicle and watched flags flutter quietly across town, not as politicized symbols, but as reminders of sacrifice. She knew justice wasn't found in a single signature. It was a process, and each voice that rose was one step further. She had once believed all she had to do was do her job quietly, with integrity, no applause required. But now, seeing Elijah's name etched into law, she understood. Sometimes standing up and demanding fairness was also a form of service. That night, back in her quarters, Alyssa removed her gloves, unfastened her coat, and hung it on its wooden hook, as she had done every day. But this time, before sitting at her desk, she pulled out a sheet of blank paper and began writing her annual report. This year, I did not fight a war, but I fought in a battle, quiet, deep, and longer than any campaign. And we won. Not because we were powerful, but because we were right. The story of Elijah Ward, a young man who just wanted to serve, was no longer a stray headline in the news cycle. It was now the name of a federal law. And every time that name was spoken, America remembered and stepped closer to what it could be. As for Alyssa, tired as she was, she chose to continue. Not because fear no longer existed, but because too many had chosen not to look away. And for her, that was enough to keep serving, not with a new oath, but with a daily act repeated again and again. Protect the truth, preserve dignity, and never let anyone be quietly forgotten simply because they were born in a skin the system hadn't yet learned to respect. The mission was over, but its echoes never left Alyssa's mind. After safely escorting Elijah home and witnessing his name etched into a new federal law, she returned to base and resumed her training duties as she had for years. But somewhere in the folds of her uniform each morning, in the quiet cadence of her steps leaving the strategy room, she always carried the image of one young soldier, his eyes bright like sunrise, and the unfinished promise whispered through a mother's trembling hands. Every weekend, when not on duty, Alyssa would drive to a quiet neighborhood on the southern edge of the city, where Clara lived in a modest two-story house with a gray-shingled roof. That house was where Elijah first signed his enlistment papers, where Clara once cooked his favorite spicy stew before deployment. Alyssa didn't visit as a colonel or a protector, but simply as a daughter visiting her mother. No ceremony. Just the quiet gestures of loss, no longer counted in tears, but in small visits that carried a box of pastries, a modest bouquet, or only warm hands held across a weathered table. They often sat in the backyard, beneath the shade of an old oak tree, at a creaky wooden table. Clara would recall stories of Elijah as a boy, the time he fell off his bike and refused to cry, or how he once stood tall in a schoolyard while other kids teased him for dreaming too loudly of becoming a soldier. Alyssa listened like a historian, not recording but absorbing, each memory carved quietly into her own, a way of keeping Elijah close. Elijah's story no longer ended with a folded flag or a headline. It continued in quiet, lasting ways, in the very place where injustice had first cracked open. Houston Intercontinental Airport. On an early autumn morning, sunlight streamed through the tall glass panels, casting a soft glow over the second-floor terminal. Just beside the security checkpoint, a new room stood finished. Transparent doors, bronze trim polished to a quiet shine, and at the center, a plaque etched in solemn serif, Ward Honor Hall. It wasn't a lounge. There were no ads, no overhead flight announcements, no rush. It was a space dedicated to families of fallen service members, those in transit, not to destinations, but to farewells. The photos lining the walls were raw, untouched. Moments of final embraces, hands on flag-draped coffins, mothers too tired to cry but still standing tall as if to honor a promise made by a child who once said he'd come home. Ward Honor Hall wasn't just a room. It was the physical embodiment of something long overdue: respect. On its opening day, the person chosen to cut the ribbon wasn't an airport executive or a politician. It was Alyssa Morgan. But she said only one thing: honor is not measured by how many medals you've earned, but by how you treat those who quietly carry the weight of something few others understand. Respect is not a reward, it should be a reflex. Then she stepped beside Clara, took her hand gently, and together they cut the red ribbon. The applause that followed was soft, not flashy, not forced, but warm, like the first sun of winter fallen through an old wooden porch. Since that day, handwritten letters began arriving at Houston Airport, notes from military families across the country. Some wrote only a few lines, thanking the staff for making them feel seen while receiving a loved one's remains. Others enclosed photographs of their sons or daughters in uniform, scribbled with lines like, "He thought no one would remember him if he fell. Thank you for proving him wrong." In a rare television appearance, when asked what had kept her grounded throughout the ordeal, Alyssa replied with a voice nothing's a breeze. "I once promised Elijah he wouldn't go alone, but then I realized so many others have already walked alone, not on foreign soil, but on the soil of their own country. I can't fix it all, but I can do my part, with care and with consistency." Days passed, flights resumed, crowds returned to the terminals as though the storm had never been. But for those who paid attention, something had shifted. Security guards paused a moment longer when they saw a uniform. Ground staff nodded subtly when passing a flag-draped coffin. And some passengers chose not to look away when they saw a grieving woman in black sitting quietly in the corner. The change wasn't in headlines anymore. It lived in the details. In this way, people now chose to see what they had once overlooked. And in that choice, multiplied 1,000 times, was the beginning of a better country, all born from one unfinished promise, now honored in full. The story of Alyssa Morgan closes, but it opens a new law, one written from the sweat and silent tears shed in a terminal once thought emotionless. She didn't just keep a promise to Elijah Ward's mother. She awakened a nation lulled into apathy by the comfort of procedure. Through unwavering conviction and quiet dignity, Alyssa proved that respect is not a privilege. It is the bare minimum any human being deserves, whether wrapped in a uniform or simply living in a skin too often shadowed by prejudice. And you, have you ever seen someone dismissed, ignored, or belittled simply because they didn't fit the mold? And when it happened, did you stay silent or did you stand up? If this story made you rethink justice, truth, or courage, like, share, and subscribe so that voices like hers are never buried beneath silence again.